Cuban Giants were formed in 1885 at the Argyle Hotel in Babylon, New York. They were the first black professional baseball team. Some of the earliest newspaper articles about the team refer to them as Lane's Colored Giants, after their financial backer, John Lane. Despite the name, there actually weren't any Cuban players on the team. There are a lot of theories about where the name came from, but one of which is that they played in Cuba from the winter of 1885 and 1886, and the winter of 1886 and 1887. And, ironically, being seen as Cuban may have helped them get better treatment at hotels. And, speaking of 1886, on July 21st of that year, the Giants played a very historic game. On that day, the first black professional baseball team played against the first professional baseball team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings. The Giants had only been around for a year, and one of the last white teams they played beat them 11-3, so this was a chance for them to show just how talented they really were. And on that day, in front of a sold-out crowd, that's exactly what they did, defeating the Stockings 9-4 and becoming the first black team to beat a professional white team, showing that black teams could play just as well, or even better, than white teams. And the crazy thing about this is that this was before the Negro Leagues were even officially a thing. At this time, the Giants were independent, but throughout their existence they played for many leagues. In 1888, they won the Colored Championship Series, defeating teams like the New York Gorms and the Pittsburgh Keystones, who were also prominent black baseball teams from that era. The Giants were disbanded in 1915, 5 years before Rube Foster would found the official Negro Leagues. In 1896, members of the Cuban Giants split from the team to form the Cuban X-Giants, and they will be based in Trenton, New Jersey. That next year, they would actually beat the Cuban Giants 2-1 in the series. And, like the original Cuban Giants, the players were not Cuban. Well, at least not at first. Eventually, they would begin adding actual Cubans to the team. In 1903, they won the Colored Championship Series, defeating the Philadelphia Giants. And they did this with the help of none other than Rube Foster, the eventual founder of the Negro National League, which wouldn't happen until about 17 years later. Just 2 years after becoming the Colored Champions, the Giants would have another impactful victory. During that year, they played a 2-game series against the Brooklyn Dodgers, the team that would later sign Jackie Robinson, and actually won one of the games. And while they didn't win the series, they will become one of the first black teams to defeat a major league team, similar to how the Cuban Giants defeated the Red Stockings. And again, proving that African Americans have just as much of a place in America's pastime. 2 years after that, the X-Giants folded. The team that first had the name Cuban Stars was started by Abel Linares and Tinti Molina in 1907. And they started off as a traveling team that would play against teams on the eastern side of the United States. Eventually, they would begin traveling west, playing teams like Chicago's Leland Giants. And everything was going good for them. By 1916, they had briefly joined the Cuban League and were still going strong as the one and only Cuban Stars. Or so they thought. See, as it turned out, it was another team that had the name Cuban Stars, and they were based in New York and were owned by a man named Alex Pompez. And now the team faced a dilemma, because there can't be two Cuban Stars. So to differentiate themselves, the team owned by Molina and Linares would go by the Cuban Stars West, because they played against Midwestern teams, while the team owned by Pompez went by Cuban Stars East. And now, that issue resolved, both teams are going to do great things. In 1919, the Cuban Stars West had the highest winning percentage of any Negro League team in the West and became Western champions. That next year, they would join the Negro National League, where they would play in for about 10 years before disbanding in 1930. While they were mostly a traveling team, in 1921, they were temporarily based in Cincinnati and went by the Cincinnati Cuban Stars and would play their home games at Redland Field. The Cuban Stars East were also a traveling team, but they sometimes played games at Dickman Oval and had great players like Martin DeHigo on their squad. They competed in the Eastern Colored League and the American Negro League until they disbanded in 1933. But even with both teams gone, the name Cuban Stars would still live on. In 1927, Sid Pollock, the man who would go on to own the Indianapolis Clowns, organized a team that went by the Havana Red Sox. The team would barnstorm around the Miami, Florida area, and in some ways served as a precursor to the Indianapolis Clowns. Pollock introduced a routine called shadow ball, which is when the infielders would pretend to throw a ball around for between inning warm-ups, something that the Clowns would later do in their games. In 1931, the team changed their name to the Cuban House of David, and that year became the only team from Cuba to be permitted entry into the United States. They were also associate members of the Negro National League at this time. Then, next year, they would join the East-West League and become Sid Pollock's Cuban Stars, which is the name they went by until they disbanded in 1936. The All-Cubans were started by Abel Linares and Tinti Molina, the eventual owners of the Cuban Stars West, in 1899. They were an independent team, and the first Latin American baseball team to tour in the United States. When they started out, the All-Cubans were filled with Cuban criollos and mestizos. But eventually, the team would go on to include Afro-Cubans. And while the diversity was welcome, it also brought them some trouble. In 1903, there were reports that the team was having issues in Florida because they had 3 black players. Their first game was on July 28, 1899, against the white semi-pro team in Weehawken, New Jersey. The All-Cubans won that game 12-4. Their most famous matchups were against the Cuban X-Giants, one of the premier Negro League teams at the time. The difference between the Cuban X-Giants and the All-Cubans, however, was that the Cuban X-Giants didn't have any Cuban players at that time. And so, the game was sort of like a battle between the real Cubans and the fake Cubans, at least in the eyes of some. The X-Giants played a 2-game series against the All-Cubans in Hoboken, New Jersey, and won both times. Although defeating the All-Cubans, the series led to a Cuban tour by the Cuban X-Giants the following year. In 1905, the All-Cubans disbanded, but not without making some history. 2 future Major League players, Armando Marsans and Rafael Almeida, got their start in the United States while playing with the All-Cubans. By the time that the 1930s had rolled around, most Negro League teams that had the name Cuban in them had disbanded. But Alice Pompez wasn't quite done putting Cubans in the league. In 1935, he created a new team based in New York and called them the New York Cubans. Despite their name, they would play most of their games at Hinch Light Stadium in New Jersey. Also, not every player on the team was actually Cuban or dark-skinned. Back then, Latino players really didn't get picked up by Major League teams, which is why the New York Cubans had white-skinned Hispanic men playing in the Negro Leagues. The Cubans played for 3 leagues during their existence, and in 1947, defeated the Cleveland Buckeyes for their first and only Negro League World Series. And they did this with the help of players like Minnie Minoso. 3 years later, the New York Cubans folded, ending the tradition of Negro League teams with the name Cuban, and helping pave the way for both black and Latino players to be accepted into the MLB.